Frank Hyder is a well-known, renowned visual artist. When he started to become an artist, he thought the journey would be a straightforward progression. Over the years, he has discovered that the road has many twists and turns, numerous hills and valleys, and countless challenges. Through this series of short stories, tales, and remembrances, his hope is that these will offer some valuable insight into the life of an artist and what's involved in becoming an artist. In the end, he has come to realize that he is not a painter or sculptor or anything in particular. He is more simply a creative person with great passion and love for the process of making art concerning people and the world around us, who shares his artworks with the public. Join us now as we listen to another episode of A Life in Art series.
The notion of a museum is very important to anyone who aspires a career in the arts, because a museum is more than just getting a prize in a juried show or getting a scholarship or a grant or something. It's an acknowledgement on the part of an institution to the unusual, exceptional, or rare quality of your ability or an effort or your talent or your work or whatever you want to refer to. Anyway, in the 1985-86 time period, I was busily working and creating work in Philadelphia and exhibiting in Philadelphia, and there were a number of small museums in the city and a number of larger museums. So every year you would apply, lots of people would apply to the small museums to have a solo show, and the big museums, very few people would apply to those because it's pretty unassailable to get through the bureaucracy of the institution. Anyway, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, which is one of the oldest museums in the United States, had a room on the museum which they dedicated to solo exhibitions, not necessarily for local artists, but for what they referred to as emerging artists. So artists from New York, artists from New Jersey, artists from Delaware, Pennsylvania, etc., would apply for exhibitions. And I saw some really good shows there, and I decided that my work was getting to a point which I thought maybe it was worthy of being looked at for a show. So I sent my slides in, and you have to wait forever on those things. You send them in, the deadline may say you got to send it in by September the 1st, but the jury doesn't look at the work until maybe October the 15th, and then that has to go through a process, and the paperwork has to be dealt with, and you get your letter of rejection or a positive letter in another month or so after that. So anyway, I submitted my work, didn't hear anything, and frankly, I wasn't necessarily expecting to hear anything. It's just a rule of thumb. You make many applications and very few of them get anywhere. Anyway, I happened to be in Center City in a gallery when another artist who was pretty well known in Philadelphia and well known in New York was in the gallery, and his name was John Moore. And John Moore started talking to me, and he said, I was on this jury at the Pennsylvania Academy that recently had looked at your work. And I said, yeah. And he said, if you have an exhibition in town, make sure you send an announcement to the curator of contemporary painting at the Philadelphia Museum. I said, why? He said, well, he was on the same jury, and he was really very enthusiastic about your work. And I said, well, that's funny because I didn't get a letter telling me I was going to have a show. I said, in fact, I got a letter telling me I wasn't going to have a show, but that they would be happy to reconsider me maybe in 2 years when my work was a little more mature. And he said, well, if I was you, I would make sure if you have a show, you send them an announcement. Well, as it was, about a month later, I was scheduled to have a show at the Moore Gallery. And I got one of the cards and I personally addressed it to the curator at the Philadelphia Museum, whose name was Mark Rosenthal. And I sent that card and didn't have any expectations. But the morning the show opened, the very first day, 10 a.m., he was in the gallery and he wanted to see the show. So he walked through, looked at the whole show, and then walked up to the desk at the end and said to the girl at the desk, he said, look, the Philadelphia Museum of Art would like to place this painting on reserve. And he walked away. Well, the dealer called me on the phone. He said, look, this has never happened before, but the curator of 20th Century Art came in and put something on reserve. And I said, well, what does that mean? It says, well, he said, what that means is that we can't sell it. We have to send it to the museum, and they're going to consider whether they want to buy it or not. And I said, oh, that's good. So anyway, time passed, and the day came that the show ended, and a truck came to pick up the work and take it to the Philadelphia Museum. And at the same time, the trucker was told to pick up two other works, so they would have a total of 3 pieces to take to the museum. So he took 3 pieces. All of them were 4 by 8 feet, and that was it. They went in the museum, and I didn't know what would happen to them. And so what I did find out later, what they did was they hung the 3 pieces up in the office area of the museum where all the curators could see it, but they were not to the public. And they eventually, the day would come when they would vote on what works would be purchased by the museum and which would not. And eventually, I got a letter from the museum telling me that they had agreed to purchase a painting called The Sea Watcher, which was a tall painting of a figure wrapped in towels standing by the edge of an ocean. And so I was pretty pleased with that. And then about a week later, I got a phone call from a guy who I knew who worked at the art museum. And he said, hey, man, you should get over here because your painting is hung up in the museum. And I got on my bike and rode over to the art museum and went in. And sure enough, there it was hanging on the wall. And it was pretty much very close by the wonderful new work by Anselm Kiefer that the museum had purchased. And I was a little embarrassed seeing my painting on the wall. And I walked up close to the painting. And as I got close, the guard told me, get back. You're not allowed to get that close. And I said to the guard, I said, look, it's my painting. And he said, I don't care whose painting it is. You're not allowed to get that close. So anyway, I stood across the room for a while and watched people looking at the painting. And I went home. Well, time passed, and about another week or so, I got another letter from the Pennsylvania Academy, from the curator, who was the head of that jury, that had sent me a letter 2 months earlier telling me in a couple of years maybe I could try again. And the letter said, we would like to look at your work again. So what I did was I got the same package I had given them 3 months earlier, put it back together and sent it over to her. And then shortly thereafter got a letter announcing that the Pennsylvania Academy was going to give me a show in the museum. And I could then start planning and working towards the show because the show would be off in the distance about 8 or 9 months. So I proceeded to work on what I considered the most important body of work I had ever done and may still be the most important. The title of that body of work was called Les Pleurantes, which is a French word which refers to the crying ones or the mourning ones. And I had seen these really interesting sculptures at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They were these little figures that were standing, and they looked like mountains of cloth, but when you got up close to them, they were representing monks who were in their monks' robes. But when you got close, you could see that they had really exquisitely detailed, carved hands and faces. And at a distance, this abstract quality, when you got up close, this really realistic quality. And the work was by a German artist by the name of Klaus Sluter. I did some reading about him, and I came up with a kind of an idea. And the idea was I was making these big wooden faces, so I added the notion of a hood or a crown around the heads, like a monk would wear, and I threw shadows across the face. But then I was chopping the wood and splitting off the pieces and then painting the wood, nailing it back on. And they were really very, very powerful. So at a distance, they looked like faces, but as you got close to them, they looked like abstractions, which was kind of the mirror image of what I liked in the pieces I saw at the Metropolitan. Anyway, time passed, and the months turned into the time to bring the show into the museum. And so I had the paintings delivered to the museum. And doing a museum show, you really don't have much to do with it because the museum has professional installers. They have a plan. They have a way of working. And to put it mildly, they work carefully. They work slowly. And they work slower than you can imagine. So something that in a gallery might take a day and a half, in a museum can take 5 to 6 days. So anyway, the show went up. The opening happened. It was a huge turnout. I got a great review. There was lots and lots of interest. And I'm absolutely certain to this day that I would never have gotten the show had the curator of the museum not selected my work for inclusion in the museum collection, and that helped me get the museum show. Based on all of that, when I got to South America, the fact that I had some museum shows, the opportunity to have a show in the Museum of Contemporary Art in Caracas came up, and we installed much of the same work that had been at the show at the Pennsylvania Academy. And one of the difference was at the Pennsylvania Academy, I had a large diptych which opened like a window. You could open these. It was 8 by 8 closed. It was a big face, and you opened it, and it opened to 8 by 16 feet, and it was a big landscape image with a big monumental figure in the foreground. Anyway, when I put that in the Pennsylvania Academy, they would not let the public touch the piece. So I had to have somebody wearing white gloves there to manipulate the piece and show the piece. When I got to South America and I told them that I wanted the public to be able to interact with the piece, they immediately made that possible. And it just kind of like tells you that there are some subtle differences. So based on that show, I was offered an exhibition in Maracaibo, Venezuela, which is in the area where the Great Lake Maracaibo is and where much of the oil work is done. It's very hot there, but the largest museum of contemporary art in South America exists in that place. And I was invited to have an exhibition in one entire building of the museum, which was about 30,000 square feet. So all the work that I had made in my 1-year stay in Venezuela was brought to the museum. And then the museum in Caracas, which had purchased several pieces from me in my show there, loaned the pieces to the museum in Maracaibo as well. And then when I got to the museum in Maracaibo, I've had more and more experience working in these with museum people and understanding how things work. So when I saw the space, I realized that I could make a site-specific piece, and there was a great open space, 3 stories tall, so you could look over the edge from the 3rd floor onto the 1st floor. So right there on the spot, I made a sketch of an idea and showed it to the head curator and told him what I wanted to do, which was essentially we spread plastic on the floor And I had workers go out and dig dirt from around the museum and bring it inside. And then with my children, we spread it out all on the floor over this plastic. And then I got down on my hands and knees on the plastic and just with my fingers drew an enormous figure about 30 feet tall that would be visible from above looking down. And the space was all clearly defined on the edge by placing another series of my images that were done in ceramic tile to create the great big form like a big canoe around the outside of this big drawing on the floor. And, so the museum offered me much more of an opportunity, and I brought to it a lot more experience. And over the years, as that's continued, I've done several more museum shows, a total of 18 different museums in different parts of the United States and in Colombia, in Venezuela, in Mexico, in California, in New York, in Florida. And each time I come to the site with the idea that the curator has, and I'm always able to sort of dialogue and work with the curator and build a show that's not like a show that you would have in a gallery. It's a show that can only have in a public venue, a public space like that. So the idea of showing in a museum is an idea, and then there's the reality and the experience of showing in the museum. And I've been blessed by the fact that I've had the opportunity to do both.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions or suggestions for future episodes, please reach out to Frank Hyder on Facebook or Instagram. We hope to see you at one of the next A Life in Art episodes.